Adams Institute, if you haven't been here before, and welcome back. For those of you who've been here once, twice, or many times, like Gabby Landry, our special presenter today at the Abigail Adams Institute Student Scholar Workshop. Gabby will be introduced shortly by Karen Boland, who is the director of Abigail Adams Institute's Practical Wisdom Project, and she was also the headmistress of Montrose School for when Gabby was a student there, so she knows Gabby when she was very little too, somewhat little. Karen now is our senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute, and we've done so many wonderful projects together, and we're going to do so much more here at the Abigail Adams Institute. So I wanted to have Karen introduce Gabby so some of the students also know about the Practical Wisdom Project. But briefly, for those of you who don't know about Abigail Adams Institute, we are an independent scholarly institute, so we're not Harvard, we're independent from Harvard, we're organized as a not-for-profit. So Harvard's a not-for-profit, we're a not-for-profit. They're 45 billion, we're much less than that. But we work with the Harvard faculty, even though we're independent, we work closely with Harvard faculty, students, that includes graduate students and of course undergraduates, on various supplementary projects, and not just Harvard students. We have students here from Boston University, MIT, Boston College, but primarily Harvard students on humanities broadly understood. So anything from even political science or political theory to art and architecture. That is our sort of métier. That's not probably the right word because we're not specialists. We're kind of generalists. We're bold.
Thank you, Danilo, and welcome. And if we were not gathered to give Gabby feedback on her paper, I could take the floor for a long time. So one of the beneficiaries of the COVID era leave of absence was Montrose School, because Gabby took that leave not only to take care of her grandparents, but also to spend some time teaching, serving as a research institute at our Life Compass Institute at Montrose School, which is a community of practice lab where teachers practice interventions and trial and test them. And so Gabby was a research assistant to me on some publications and work, and helped with the faculty there and taught. And so that was a great gift. And so naturally, when I began my third chapter after I stepped down as head of school, I looked to engage Gabby as a research assistant on the Practical Wisdom Project. And as many of you know, Aristotle says there's 3 types of wisdom, 3 aims of knowing. It's in book 6 of his Ethics. The first is theoretical wisdom, or science aimed at knowing, understanding. The second is the wisdom aimed at taking action at the right time, for the right reason, with the right understanding of context. And that's that know-how in a professional context, that's savvy to know what to do when you don't know what to do. And then the third is productive reason, or creative reason, art, what we do, produce, and perform. And it's a joy for me to introduce our Harvard senior with a major in philosophy and in education, and our Tertullian fellow here at the Abigail Adams Institute, because she embodies all 3 types of wisdom in her approach to research, big questions, in distilling what's applicable and what will make positive change in all of our lives now and for future generations. And she's expert at distilling, creating, producing, and performing what's useful and what's beautiful and helpful to all of us. And I'm going to leave 2 things she distilled and created for Abigail Adams Institute and undergraduates at Harvard in connection with the Harvard Art Museums, because the practical wisdom is all about learning to see and choose art as a medium to foster reflection and connection. But because I don't want to steal your time, I'm not going to go any further. You can read more about that online. But I'm really excited about your paper and excited for the conversation today. So welcome, Gabby.
Thank you so much, Karen. and thanks everyone for being here today. It's great to see so many friends and mentors and folks from around Harvard and Montrose as well. I think I know everyone in the room, but if you don't know me, I'm Gabby, and I'm a senior studying philosophy and education. And the reason I'm here today is to share my research on COVID-era leaves of absence at Harvard, what students experienced, how they developed their life skills, and then recommendations for Harvard administrators. And so first, I want to take us back in time a little bit to March 2020. I think all of us have a lot that comes to mind when we hear those two words, but for the students in the room, I think one of the biggest things that we remember is this email from President Larry Bacow, which we got on Tuesday, March 10th in the morning, where he told us that we would be transitioning to online instruction and that we were not to return after our spring break. So after a few minutes of extreme confusion, we got this slightly more clarifying email from Dean Rakesh Khurana that we would have to move. College students across the country, across the world, but truly everyone. And part of those changes were all the new words we were hearing. We learned what Zoom was, online learning, de-densify, we were told to stay at home, to wear our masks, to socially distance. And so as we went home, amidst all this confusion, we were also waiting to hear what would happen for the following year. And then we did hear in the summer, in July, we learned that for the following academic year, we would have completely remote instruction. Only freshmen would be on campus in the fall, and then only seniors on campus in the spring. And so while this was going on, and we were all at home having conversations with our friends, with our family, online, and a little bit in person, students were deciding what to do. Would we enroll online? Would we live at home? Would we try to get an exception to live on campus? And what a huge number of students ended up doing, an unprecedented number, was take a leave of absence. So although the official numbers aren't publicly available, the Crimson had reported that over 20% of undergrads did not intend to enroll in fall 2020. In other words, they decided that they wanted to take time off either for the semester or for the entire year. And as Karen mentioned, as you probably know, I was also one of those students. The photo on the left is me with my roommate Sarah on March 14th, the day I left campus. We looked far too happy. We did not know what was coming. But I ended up moving back home with my enormous family. I lived with my parents, 8 of my 9 siblings, and 2 foster siblings. For me, as you could probably imagine, online learning at home was not really possible in that environment. And as Karen mentioned, I also wanted to help care for my grandparents. And so from North Attleboro, where my parents live, I moved to Mansfield to live with them. And then I worked in Medfield at Montrose for the remainder of the year. And so as I came back for my junior year in fall 2021, I started to wonder, what did all these other students experience? This was such a big conversation coming back on campus, like, oh, what did you do during COVID? I took time off. Oh, what did you do with your time off? But those conversations tended to be just that, very brief. And so I knew that there was so much more that students experienced, and I was curious. So I wanted to know, why did so many students take time off, and what did they experience? How did those experiences affect them? And then in light of all of this data from all these students who had taken time off at the same time, what could Harvard do differently? And what I found was that almost all students took time off for pandemic-related reasons, perhaps unsurprisingly. Taking a leave of absence during the pandemic enables students to develop their life skills and was, for most people, a very beneficial, meaningful experience. And finally, Harvard has room for improvement on leave of absence policies and culture. And I'll say more about all of this. But to get to those findings, just an overview of the study. So I started with a survey. 87 students participated, and just for the purpose of kind of narrowing the scope, I focused only on students who were originally in the classes of 2021 or 2022. So at the time of the study, they were social seniors or super seniors. And then I moved on to one-on-one interviews. So from those who participated in the survey, I interviewed 34 students. And then from there, those who participated in the interviews had the chance to join a focus group and answer more of the questions that I had in conversation with other students. And each of those phases kind of corresponded to the different questions that I had. So why did so many students take time off? The chart on the left shows the reasons that students cited, from most important to the least important and least applicable. And again, pandemic-related reasons like avoiding online classes or not being able to live on campus really dominated the top of the list. A lot of students felt that this wasn't like the real college experience that they wanted to have. 60% of students considered mental or physical health a moderately important reason, so maybe not the driving factor in their decision, but something that they saw as something that they wanted to work on during their leave. Another group of moderately important reasons were those related to students' sense of comfort or preparation. So whether they knew other friends taking time off, whether they felt like once they came back they would still know people, and whether they had some kind of plan or goal for their time. The survey also explored what students experienced on a sort of collective level. So most students, 60%, lived in their childhood or family home for some or all of their leave. About half lived with friends or a significant other at some point. 16% of students lived alone. And the chart on the right shows you the most common to least common activities that students had. 61% of students spent most of their time working a paid job or internship. Other common experiences were unpaid internships, volunteering, academic work, hobbies, and working on mental or physical health, so maybe seeing a therapist or just resting, reading, and reflecting. So how did those experiences affect them? And to really look into this, I needed to do in-depth interviews. So like I mentioned, I sat down with 34 students who participated in the survey, and this was like the most impactful part of the research experience for me, just sitting down with these students and hearing everything they had to share. From highly unusual, I talked to students who biked across the country, who lived internationally, met their biological father for the first time, all the way to the everyday experiences, students who just hung out with hometown friends, read books, wrote, but truly no two stories were the same. And I think this study, as much as it tries to come to a few conclusions, there is just such a range. But in order to come to some kind of conclusion, I decided to focus on life skills and competencies development, as colleges are increasingly interested in finding out how they can actually impart life skills to their students after graduation. The boxes on the bottom just highlight a few other angles that I could have taken from this research. For example, I had several students in my study who had lost close family members during their time off, so I think bereavement or grief is another important area to explore. I had a very significant representation of first-gen and low-income students in my survey, overrepresented compared to the number of those students at Harvard. Other angles are forced leave of absence, as the majority of those who participated in my study took this leave voluntarily. And another angle would be like international students, for example, having to make the decision whether to go back to their home country or try to find a way to remain enrolled. So on the life skills point, I saw the findings kind of come down into 4 categories where you can see in this list. And I'll go through each of these, but just as a broad overview, the titles kind of sum it up, but practical skills such as adulting, cooking, budgeting, doing your laundry, those skills that help you just like live everyday life out on your own. Relational skills just refers to interpersonal skills, like setting boundaries, navigating changing relationships, maybe living with roommates or strangers. Professional skills, as I mentioned, since working was the most common activity, students were able to explore new career paths or maybe solidify ones they've been thinking about. They were able to think about work-life balance, maybe have a 9-to-5 schedule for the first time. And then finally, personal, which I think came out most strongly in the interviews, but how this experience really changed students' perspectives, their idea of their life priorities or what they saw as their goals in life, as well as their mental or physical health. So looking at each category a little more closely, the practical skills, I thought these quotes from the interviews were pretty telling. One student said, "Truly what I ended up spending a lot of time on was just being a normal person, learning to cook. I didn't know that you had to put oil down on the pan before putting things down on the pan." And she and I laughed a lot about this because it's real. If you grow up and then you go to college, you've never cooked for yourself, you won't know things like this, and you just learn through experience. Another student reflected on the many things of adulting that you don't think about and you just get kind of thrown into after graduation. It's like budgeting, looking for an apartment, or paying rent. On the relational side, as mentioned, students were learning how to set boundaries, redefine relationships, or live with their parents, friends, or strangers. One student told me about how she was living with a mix of friends and strangers in Israel, and some people had strong opinions about leaving the lights on in the room. Some people forgot to turn the lights off, and so there was like a passive-aggressive sticky note war where people would leave notes by the lights passive-aggressively telling them to remember to turn them off. So navigating situations like those. Again, professional experience. One student told me about how he had heard about this idea of consulting before, but taking time off and taking a consulting internship let him see that this was something he wanted to do. Other students reflected on being able to actually experience an internship or volunteering in the medical space, solidified pre-med goals, and those are just two examples. And I think personal is really where the interviews got very profound in some cases, but a lot of students use this word perspective, reflecting on the fact that at Harvard, life is so fast-paced that when you get this chance to slow down, you can really reflect on what matters and what doesn't, or what they want to get out of life. And these are a few quotes that I think exemplify that. One student said, "I'm not sure where I'll end up long term, but I think the perspective that I needed in order to allow myself the freedom and the confidence to explore the options that are out there, to make the most of the resources that are here at Harvard, to open up doors for future opportunities, I would attribute that to having the time to reflect during the gap year." Another student said that the gap year showed them a lot of things that matter and do not matter, and put things into perspective. And then finally, sort of echoing the mission of Harvard that we all hear all the time as a transformative experience. For one student, taking time off was completely transformative, forcing her to grow in ways during the past few years and help her understand how she's become the person she is today. As I mentioned before, for most students, it was a very beneficial and meaningful experience. Virtually no regret about taking a leave of absence. Students felt that it changed their goals in life or helped them gain clarity about their goals. They felt that their leave of absence was largely positive, and almost all strongly agreed that their leave of absence was a meaningful experience. This was particularly interesting for students who said that their leave was not largely positive, those students who maybe lost family members or experienced food insecurity or housing insecurity. They still felt that their leave was very meaningful. So moving into what Harvard could do differently, this was kind of the point of the focus groups. One student in the focus group felt that taking time off should be as normal as study abroad. And another said it would have been nice to have some acknowledgement that we were gone. And so these focus groups helped me understand a few recommendations for what Harvard could do before, during, and after a student's leave of absence. This chart kind of summarizes. We can talk more in detail during the Q&A, but just as an overview, students felt that they would benefit from having more information about the idea of a leave of absence, the possibilities that they could pursue, and also a little more positive or at least neutral messaging about leaves of absence. This gets a little more complicated when some leaves of absence are not very positively associated, if a leave of absence is forced by the college, or if there are some extenuating family circumstances that can be a little more difficult. During the leave of absence, students recommended that there should be opt-in involvement or contact with the university so they don't feel so cut off, but they have the option to have some contact if they'd like. And also access to resources and support. So students in the focus group talked about how they didn't know that they wouldn't have library access. They didn't know that they wouldn't have access to CARET, which is the database for finding like funding resources. And then after the leave of absence, it would be helpful to give students the opportunity to reorient themselves when they come back to campus. So whether that's like a meeting in their house about things that have changed, or an email collecting all the information about like, oh, you have to register in advance for classes now and there's no more shopping week. And logistical support. So one student recommended just having like an earlier move-in date if you're coming back from a leave, or just meetings with different offices around Harvard so that they know what resources are available. I think this came out especially clearly with a student in my study who was originally in the class of 2018. So he had taken several leaves of absence, and on a previous leave of absence, he returned, didn't know that shopping week had been done away with, and so he kind of struggled to find his classes. He registered late, and then throughout the beginning of the semester really struggled in his classes to do well. He ended up having to take a forced leave of absence for failing 2 classes, and so, you know, it just makes you wonder if he had had that kind of support before, he wouldn't have had to take more time off and prolong his educational path. And finally, where do we go from here? There's so many other angles to this research, as I mentioned before, bereavement, FGLI students, international students. Just because it was only me working on this study, I had to limit the scope of who I was talking to, but it would be great to hear experiences of students from other class years who also took time off. It would also be great to investigate non-COVID leaves of absence, whether pre-COVID or now post-COVID, as well as forced leave, because I do think that merits additional study. And then finally, as I mentioned, the recommendations, it does seem like there are opportunities for Harvard to improve institutionally, but we can also center student voices, as now we have such a large cohort of students who have gone through a leave of absence. Hopefully they can pass down that knowledge to future generations.